one of the I think advantages I hope that you get from taking classes from people who don't just give you the textbook, but also like practice the material as their science, is that in the lectures, occasionally you're going to get to see results that are just out, a few months ago. And that's the case today. It doesn't happen every lecture, of course, but I also think that having courses like this, which gets you professors that actually do some of the work, allows you to learn some of the material that is state of the art. Now, we'll see a little bit of that today, which has to do with techniques that are being used for getting people who have been spinal cord injury sufferers to walk. I'll show you what we've learned. So usually I have a microphone, but you don't have a microphone for me.
Not today.
So,
Technical difficulties.
Okay, well, I'm sorry about that. All right, so I'm going to tell you about muscle types and some of the mechanisms of proprioception and the reflexes that are in the spinal cord, and discuss for you a little bit about recent work on mechanisms, electrically stimulation mechanisms to get people to walk. All right. On Wednesday, I showed you this cartoon where you see these things called extrafusal muscle fibers. Those are the fibers that generate force. They're innervated by alpha motor neurons. So this is the neuromuscular junction. Then there are these intrafusal muscle fibers that don't generate force, but they are part of the sensor system. We're going to talk a little bit about that today. They are innervated afferents called spindle afferents. And they're also innervated by motor neurons called gamma motor neurons. All right, so extrafusal muscle fibers, the muscle fibers that generate the force. Now, we have two basic types of muscle fibers. The ones that are slow in how they respond to an action potential. They give you a twitch, but the twitches takes a long time for it to form, and the magnet is small. Those muscle fibers, what's special about them is that they don't seem to fatigue with repeated stimulation. The second type of muscle fiber is type 2. These are fast twitch muscle fibers. An action potential gives you rise in force that's fairly quick, its duration is short, but what's different about them is that they tend to fatigue. And some of them fatigue less, some of them fatigue more, but they have these two different kinds of responses. So slow and fast. And they have to do with the specific kind of myosin that's part of it. Their metabolism is different. They're innervated by different kinds of motor neurons in the sense of fast motor neurons versus slow motor neurons. I'll talk in some detail about this structure. And also, these muscle fibers, the composition of a muscle depends on whether that muscle is used for continuous use, like your diaphragm muscle, or is it used for occasional use, like your leg muscle. So basically, there's certain muscles in your body that you don't want to ever fatigue. So you don't want to ever get tired of breathing. So I got to take a break for a while. Let the diaphragm muscle rest a little. Well, you can't do that. So the diaphragm muscle is entirely slow type muscle fibers. On the other hand, certain muscles that you use for explosive power, like your leg muscles, where you want to be able to jump, has much higher concentrations of the type 2 muscle fibers. Now, I'll show you that it used to be thought that you have these muscle fibers and then that's what you get for the entire life. There's no change in it. But by studying severe cases of lack of use, which happens when you get spinal cord injury, so you can think of individuals who are lazy and maybe not lazy, but they don't exercise very much. So maybe their composition of some muscle might be different than somebody who exercises a lot. But the extreme case of that is spinal cord injury, where you just can't use that muscle at all. And by studying the spinal cord injury muscles that have been affected, you notice that there is this transition from one muscle fiber to the other. And what happens is that individuals who've lost the ability to control their muscles, those muscles become almost entirely entirely type 2, fast fatigue. And so lack of use seems to transition these muscles from one kind to the other. They become more fatigable. And I'll show you that in some data. Okay, so here's some data on what slow and fast type muscle fibers look like. Well, I'm going to call them motor units because in fact this muscle fiber is of course attached, it's being controlled by a motor neuron, and that motor neuron is going to go and innervate a whole bunch of muscle fibers. That collection together all has the same property. So all the motor units, all the muscle fibers that belong to a single motor unit have the same property. So if they're all slow, for example, here's their twitch response. So here's a single action potential given to a motor unit, and you see here's the twitch that develops, the slow fiber. It's about 200 to 300 milliseconds in duration, has a magnitude of about 1 gram. Now, what's special about these slow muscle fibers is that if you stimulate them continuously, like you see here, for 1 hour, they keep on producing that force. Here's a fatigue-resistant but fast type of the muscle fibers, type 2A, and you see that it produces a force. The force is about 10 grams, and its duration is about the same as the slow type of muscle fiber. But you see that it holds the force for the first 2 to 3 minutes, but then it really can't hold it beyond 5 minutes. So by 1 hour, it is fatigued if you were to continuously stimulate. Here's a fast fatigable, which is type 2X. You see that it produces 50 grams of force, a lot, but even at less than 1 second, this is 250 milliseconds, you see that you're already beginning to see a decline in the force that it's producing, and by 1 minute, it's essentially no longer able to produce more than 10% of the maximum force. So slow, it's just fatigue, non-fatigable, fatigue resistant, and fast fatigue. Okay, so what's the difference between fast and slow in terms of their metabolism, their responses, and so forth? It's summarized in this slide. So the slow type of motor units, they have axons that innervate them that are small, versus the fast type, they have axons that have large diameter. So a large diameter axon, of course, gives you a faster transmission of the action potential. The speed of contraction is slow for the slow type, it's fast for the fast type. The slow has little fatigue resistance, fast fatigable is rapid, and more importantly, the mechanism for metabolism for the slow type is aerobic, whereas it's anaerobic for the fast type. All right. So here's an example of a particular muscle. This is the quadriceps, the thigh muscle. And I want to show you the percentage of the muscle fiber that is in this muscle. So in the quadriceps, an average active person, so for almost all of them here, the quadriceps is made up of about 50% slow and about 40% fast type 2 and 2A and about 10% fast fatigue. So as you change your lifestyle, so here's a middle distance runner, here's a world-class marathon runner, and an extreme endurance athlete, you see that the quadriceps changes in its composition. So with more use, it becomes more of the slow type. On the other hand, with a sprinter, a person who has to produce explosive power, you see that it is even lower. The slow becomes about 20%, and a person with spinal cord injury, it becomes negligible. So exercise changes the composition of the muscle fibers. It tends to make them more of the slow endurance type. And honestly, I don't know the kind of exercise that you would have to do for a sprinter. It must be fundamentally different than a long distance runner. Because, you know, of course, it's possible that you're born naturally with a certain composition of more of one kind than the other. And maybe you're also born with a predisposition so that a certain kind of exercise would make that muscle fibers transition from one period to the other. But I would suspect that sprinters, they must exercise in a very different way than obviously, extreme endurance. Do you guys know about that? Want to share that with us? Anybody is a cross-country runner versus a sprinter? Yeah?
Yeah, I'm a distance runner.
Wow.
And I'm a distance runner, and it's very different. Like sprinting is more close to throwing in track and field than it is to distance running.
More close to throwing? Is that?
Yeah, because of like the training is more like weight intensive and like trying to have like peak output versus sustained output.
Thank you. Any other comments? Did anybody else want to make a comment about this slide? Yeah, don't be shy. Okay. All right, so we have motor neurons that send their axon, innervate the muscle fibers. That makes a motor unit. And we saw that one way by which the motor unit can produce force in its muscles is by increasing its firing. And so you see that here, a unit, motor unit begins firing, and as you increase the voluntary force that you're producing, that force increases as the units begin firing more. Now, at some point, the first unit is then joined by a second unit. That increases its force, then a third, then a fourth. So you see that there's recruitment, meaning that as you increase the force you want to produce in the muscle, you not only get increased activity in the motor unit, but that new motor units come out. So remember that motor units go to these muscle fibers. There are slow type of motor units that don't produce a lot of force. There are fast type of motor units that produce a lot of force. So you would guess that the units that are recruited early are those slow type motor units. The units that are recruited late are the fast type motor units, right? That would make sense because then we'll be producing a lot of force. So let's see experimental evidence for this. This recruitment process is what we're describing now. Is that as you want to generate more force, what's the mechanism by which new neurons are added to the force production mechanism? And it's through recruitment. First, the slow twitch motor units, and then the fast motor units. Okay. So here's an experiment that shows you how to look at those motor units and the forces that they produce. So here's a human hand, and between the thumb and the index finger, there's a force transducer. And the objective is to try to measure the force twitch that's produced by a single muscle fiber. So the way you do it is through spike-triggered averaging. The idea is to put an electrode in the muscle and pick up the times when that muscle fiber generates a spike. And at the same time, measure the force between the finger and the thumb. And let me show you now how this one goes on. So here's the spikes being generated in the motor unit. And down here is one of those spikes. And down here is the force that's recorded at the same time as the spike. So if you just have one trace, if you only have force recording for one spike, here's what it would look like. But if you now take 10 spikes and align the data, align the force data to when you had the spike, here's slowly begin to see the effect of that force. Here's 100 spikes when all the data was aligned to when the spikes occurred, and here's 500 spikes. So now you very clearly see the response that was generated for that one motor unit. You had a spike, there was a force that it generated, but if you only have one, you can't see the force. But if you keep averaging and aligning the data to when the spike was generated, then you see the consequence of that particular motor unit. It's like me trying to, you guys say are the muscle fibers, and you're going to, each of you, produce some force, and I'm measuring the sum activity of all of you guys. Well, I can't pick out a single individual's contribution. But if that single individual pressed the button every time they produce some activity, then I could align the sum to the time when that press of the button occurred, and over averaging, I would be able to detect their sum, as long as they are uncorrelated to the rest of it. Does that make sense? So that's called spike-driven averaging. That's how you detect among the collection of units the contribution for one of them. So this is how we can now begin to see how to get the contribution of one unit. Now let's get to the question of recruitment. Here's the action potential that's generated from a muscle. So you see that there are spikes here. So this is the times when a neuron is firing, and then at this point, a second neuron comes on. So how can you tell that a second neuron comes on? Because the spikes that are generated by the second neuron are slightly different distance than the first neuron. So the distance to the electrode determines what's going to be the shape of the electrical activity that the electrode picks up. Because, you know, an electrode is just a wire. And it's like an antenna. It's picking out signals, and the distance from the unit to the electrode determines the shape of the spike that it's going to pick up. So if two units are at different distances, the first unit is going to give you one kind of spike, the second unit is going to give you a different spike. It's called spike strength. And therefore then you can tell, okay, I'm getting spikes from two units. When the first unit is generating spikes, here's what the twitch response looks like. When the second unit generates response, here's what the twitch response looks like. And you look, when the second unit comes on, it comes on after the first unit. And its shape, the shape of the force that it produces, it is faster and it is taller. So this says that during voluntary contraction, first, the motor units that come online and begin recruited are the slow type, and then comes the fast type. The second unit has a larger force response than the first one. The twitch response is larger. The system with this idea of a recruitment process. Any questions so far? Okay. So remember what I told you about how if you were to exercise, you would be in principle changing the composition of that muscle that you're exercising. Well, almost all of you prefer to use one hand to the other, right? So about 90% of you are right-handed, 10% are left-handed, which means that you exercise your right hand more than your left hand because you use it for many more things. Okay, that would say that the composition of the muscles of your preferred hand will be somewhat different than the ones that you're not preferring. And this experiment tried to get at that question. So what they did is that they looked at the dominant hand and they looked at the non-dominant. And what they found was that in the dominant hand, there was a greater proportion of type 1 muscle fibers, those slow cut muscle fibers, the ones that don't fit. And you see the distribution here. The dominant hand is in black, the non-dominant hand is in open triangles, and you see that the recruitment threshold, which means that the force level that was required for the muscle fiber, for the motor unit to become recruited, is higher for the non-dominant hand, which basically says your dominant hand tends to have more fatigue-resistant motor units. Any questions? Yeah.
Does it also tend to have more motor units, so more motor neurons per muscle fiber?
So exercise doesn't change, as far as I know, anything about the number of the neurons. It changes the metabolism of the muscle fibers, the type of the muscle fibers that are there. It may make the muscle fibers larger, which is what you get when you lift weights, but it doesn't change the number of neurons. So you don't have more motor neurons on the side that you prefer.
Then how does what explains the more controlled you have, like you can write with your right hand but not your left?
Okay, so that's the brain.
Okay.
Right? So our ability to perform tasks is because the cortex forms these maps of the world and can then control the motor neurons better. So you learn skill, like tennis. Writing is a good example. Vocalization is another example. That, it's this very complicated thing that we're doing with my tongue and my larynx and my lungs, and it's because I've learned, to do that. And writing is another example. But it's because of practice.
So when like the type of fibers changes, like in your writing and you end up with more type 1, do the type 2 like die and then you grow type 1, or do you have the same number of
They
type 2?
transition from one to the other.
They change. Okay.
That's my understanding. Although, whether anybody's actually demonstrated that there's one kind that becomes the other, I don't know the answer to that. Yeah.
How does that not lead to two different muscle fibers being part of the same unit? Like two different types of muscle fibers being part of the same unit?
So what you're suggesting then is that for that not to happen, the motor neurons will have to change as well. So this is really the reason why we call it a motor unit, is because they really share many of the same properties. And if function changes the muscle fibers, it's probably also that the motor neuron has changed. Unfortunately, these questions are really hard to answer because we're talking about the spinal cord, and it's just really hard to record things in the spinal cord, and whereas muscles are relatively easy. The brain is relatively easy. Yeah.
So does the innervation ratio for muscles ever change?
What issue?
The innervation ratio?
Innervation ratio.
Like how many fibers per 1 unit? Because we learned in epithelial lab that is part of like having precise control versus like core control.
Yeah. So, as far as I know, the only thing that changes the ratio is drastic things like disease and death of the motor neuron. And so, I don't think the size of the motor unit will change. Only the decomposition of the muscles and perhaps the nature of the neuron itself changes. Yeah.
So if someone is ambidextrous, like theoretically they would have the same number.
As far as the muscle fibers go, they're more similar. Use wouldn't differ. Great questions. Thank you. Okay, the sensory system of the muscle. So we have basically two major sensors in our muscles. We have a length sensor, muscle spindles, a force sensor, Golgi tendon organ afferents. And this is shown in this slide. So in the junction between the extrafusal muscles and the tendon is the Golgi tendon, basically afferent. So here's the process that leads to this axon that brings the information to the dorsal horn where the cell body is, and then that brings the information to the spine. So I'm going to show you the Golgi tendon organ afferents. They provide force feedback to the muscle, to the spinal cord. Which makes sense because if you look at where it's located between the extrafusal muscles and the tendon. So you can measure the force that's being applied to the tendon. It's in series with the muscle fiber. Something that's in parallel with the muscle fiber is the intrafusal fiber. The intrafusal fiber is innervated by spindle afferents. And so as the length of the extrafusal muscle fiber changes, it pulls on the intrafusal fiber, which then stretches the muscle spindles. This provides length and velocity information to the spine. So the spindles give you length and velocity information. Golgi tendon afferents give you force information. Let me show you that's some data for you to see that. So on the left is an example of a muscle spindle. What's happening is that the length of a muscle is being stretched and then held steady. And you see that the muscle spindle fires as the length is being increased and then settles back down to a level that's higher than it was before. So this transient activity is susceptible to velocity, and then the steady state activity is measuring the length of the muscle. On the right, we have a Golgi tendon organ. In this case, there's a force that's being produced, but there's no length change in the muscle. So here's the force, steady state, and then reduced back to baseline. Now what you see is that the Golgi tendon organ increases its firing, steady state and then comes back to base. So the spindle afferents signal length change, the Golgi tendon afferents signal force change. Okay. So here's an experiment that you can do with a friend. It turns out that muscle spindles are very susceptible to vibration. And so if you were to put your phone in a vibrate mode and place it on the belly of the biceps, you can vibrate the spindles. And what that does is that it gives you an illusion that the length of the biceps is getting longer. So what does that mean? So if I were to put a vibrating instrument on my biceps, I am activating the muscle spindles. That gives me the illusion that this muscle is longer than what it is, which means it gives me the illusion that my hand is here. And the way you can tell this is using an experiment. So what you do is that you have the person put their arm on a table like this, and then say, close your eyes, and I want you to use the other arm to match the angle of this arm. So, you know, I can do that. I can close my eyes and I can match the angle of this arm to this arm. Now, if you were to vibrate the muscle, what feels like is happening is that this arm is moving down here. So then what I would do, my arm is here, you vibrate it, my other arm goes down like this. Because that's what I feel is happening to this arm. Okay? So you can see how the perception of where your body is depends on the muscle spindles. One of the most amazing experiences as an illusion is to do the following. Put your hand on your nose like this, and now vibrate this muscle. What do you think will happen? It feels like your nose is growing. You gotta try this stuff. This is the part of tricks that you learn in this class. So, you know, sometimes I think that if we were to go back to some ancient times and be brought to the king and asked to prove that you come from the future with knowledge, these are the kinds of experiments you have to do to amuse the king so that you can survive for another night. You know the great story of 1,001 Nights? This is the stuff that you need. The notes from recipes. Okay. What about those gamma motor neurons? Remember, the gamma motor neurons innervate the intrafusal fibers, and the intrafusal fibers are part of the sensory system. So what the gamma motor neurons do is change the length of the intrafusal fiber so that the spindles become sensitive to length change from that length onward. Meaning that, imagine that you have a length sensor that can measure the length between these two things, let's say between my two fingers. Now, if this length becomes like this, that sensor, which is basically a spring, can go slack. So if it's stretched like this and can measure this, but if it goes like this, then that length can become smaller than its resting length, and then it won't be able to measure that. So what the gamma motor neurons do is to tighten up the intrafusal fibers so that the muscle spindles can remain able to measure length changes. Does that make sense? So it's like having a really high resolution sensor that can measure something beyond a certain baseline, but you can also change the baseline. You can make it so that it's down here or up here by changing the length of the intrafusal fibers. So now putting the whole story together, we get the anatomy of the system. What we have is that we have muscle spindles that measure the length of the extrafusal fibers. That gets transmitted via the afferents called 1A afferents, spindle afferents, using through the dorsal horn of the spinal cord. Then these neurons bring that length information to the motor neurons. They are excited. The muscle spindle afferents are excited. The motor neurons respond to that by sending excitation to the muscle fiber. So basically, the muscle spindles, when they become activated, they say that length of the muscle is large they activate the motor neurons then activate the muscles then contract, reducing the activity in the muscle, reducing and reduced length. So it's a simple feedback control system. You also have force information that's coming from the tendon that acts on inhibitory inner neurons. So if the force is large, that causes excitation on this inhibitory inner neuron, which then inhibits the motor neuron, which then reduces the activity in the muscle fiber. So too much force, reduced activity in the muscle fiber, reduction of its force generation. Okay, so you have now two feedback controllers. You have the length controller that through excitation activates the motor neuron. You have the force controller that through inhibition activates the motor neuron. And here's a summary diagram to put the story together. So you have your alpha motor neurons that produce action potentials, activates the muscle fibers. Those muscle fibers produce force. That force gets measured by the tendon organs. That force is fed back to an inner neuron that then inhibits the alpha motor neuron. The force acts on the arm or the leg or the bones or whatever structure it is. That causes a length change. That length change is measured by the muscle spindles. Those muscle spindles are controlled by these gamma motor neurons, which set the bias of these muscle spindles, which then becomes feedback, excitatory feedback that activates the alpha motor neurons. Any questions? Yeah.
So just to clarify, when you say the spindles provide excitatory feedback, do you mean that it increases in the weight causes increased muscle fiber?
Activation.
Okay.
Which is the basis of the stretch reflex, which is measured when you go to see your GP. So on your physical exam, what happens is that you sit down and the patella is examined. So maybe they have you sit like this, and then they put a hammer here, and then they hit this. Let's see if I can do that on myself. No, I can't. Yeah, well, completely inhibited. So what's happening is that by hitting the tendon, you are stretching this muscle. And by stretching the muscle, so you can pull it here, you pull on this muscle, the muscle spindles get stretched as well. That sends signals to the cell body, which then generates action potentials that activates the motor neurons on the same muscle. This muscle gets activated, the leg then comes up. It also sends activity to the antagonist muscle, that muscle gets inhibition via this inhibitory neuron, and then it gets less activity. More activity here, less activity here, to the leg then comes up. That's the stretch. All right, spinal cord injury. So I showed you on Wednesday, one of the things you can do with spinal cord injury is functional electrical stimulation. But most recently, in the last 4 months, there's been exciting development showing that another thing that one can do is to do pattern stimulation of the spinal cord. Now, the way this is done is called epidural stimulation. So the dura is this sheet that covers the nervous system. So your brain is inside the dura, your spinal cord is inside the dura. So think of it as a thick, elastic material that is protecting the nervous system. What they're doing in this experiment in humans is to put electrodes that are not going inside the nervous system, but they are epidural, which means that they are just sitting here outside the dura, and they're going to stimulate. Here's what it looks like. So here's the back of the body, and this is the L1 lumbar first segment, S2 the second sacral segment of the spinal cord. And as you see that this electrode is going from L1 to S2, and here are the contacts on this electrode. So there are, I don't know, about 20 or so contacts on the electrode. And the idea is to stimulate the dura, and particularly the back so here, where the afferents are coming in, not where the efferents. So you couldn't stimulate on the other side, right? Because you can't get to it. So what you can do is do what's called a laminectomy in the patient, and you place the electrode on the outside of the dura. And now the idea is to stimulate the dura in a spatio-temporally specific way so that the individual can then walk. And so the idea is to, for example, to stimulate on this side with this electrode so you get activity in this afferent pathway to then activate the left hip extensor and then stimulate this electrode so you get the right ankle flexor. So this electrode for the right ankle flexor, this electrode for the left hip flexor. And if you do that in the appropriate time during walking, so this is the stretch reflex, right? That's what we're talking about. So this is stimulating the dura, which is sitting right by the input from the afferents, engaging those afferents, and then asking whether does this help the patient so that they can then activate their own motor neurons. And so this is the pattern. So what happens if you stimulate? So let's look at some data. So in this case, the patient is told to pull with the left hip flexion. So to take the left hip and flex it. So try to bring it up. And what you see is that, well, they can't. There's no torque that's produced. And now you put on the epidural stimulation. So you activate this electrode. When you activate this electrode, they can gain the ability to activate their agonist. Here's isometric left ankle extension. So extend the left ankle. Well, here's when the instruction begins. They can't do it. But if you stimulate this right ankle extensor, or the left ankle, I guess inhibit the left ankle extensor, then you can see that the person can generate force with the left ankle. So the first part of the experiment is to show that a paralyzed person couldn't activate these muscles on their own, but if you stimulate the right part of the spinal cord, they can activate the muscle. All right, how does this help them walk? The idea is now to train them so that initially they're provided with some body weight support. So in this case, it says 65% body weight support. And what they're doing is that as they are walking, they have this camera, they can watch them walk, they're providing some weight support, and as they are moving their legs, they stimulate the right region at the right time, making it easier for the brain to activate those motor neurons. And you see that here. So the left TA, reticulus, tibialis anterior, right tibialis anterior. Here's when the muscles are being activated, and they are using this spatial and temporal stimulation to make that possible. So here is when they turn it off. They turn off their stimulation, and they say, look, the patient stops walking. They can't walk anymore. And then they turn it back on, and the patient can start walking. So this is very exciting because it says that with this stimulation, the patient can be assisted in their walking. Now, they're walking in a laboratory, right, with a camera that's looking at them. And in the same paper, they show you that after months of training, the patients can now go out and walk on their own with a walker, whereas before, they were paralyzed.
It looks like there's really different levels of stimulation for the left and right legs. Does that mean the left leg sounds like more nervous as it was eating?
You mean the magnitudes here?
Yeah, they're the same scale, right?
Yeah. Keep in mind, this is EMG, so I don't know if you can directly compare it. It could be just a location of the limb. Good observation. Yeah.
When they regained the ability to walk, was it because they still had the electrical stimulation, or was it because the electrical stimulation helped with those neurons?
Yeah, so you can't have the electrical stimulation outside the lab in the sense that there's no sensor to telling you what phase of the walk you're in, right? Because remember, this was done with a camera. So in the paper, they talk about how without stimulation, they are much better in their ability to walk. All right. Okay. Last topic has to do with the way the sensory information eventually reaches the cortex. All right, in this experiment, what's happening is that you have an individual who's asked to make a response to a movement. So the biceps is going to be suddenly stretched. So the arm is holding still, the biceps is stretched. Now, before the stretch, they're instructed to either respond by opposing the stretch or assisting it. So if my arm is here and I'm given an instruction that says oppose, at some point my arm is going to get stretched and I'm supposed to bring my arm back. But if I'm been instructed to assist, if my arm gets extended, I'm just supposed to let it go. But that's that. Now what I want to show you is that there's a part of the feedback system that is instruction dependent and part that is not. The part that comes from the spinal cord is always going to respond when the muscle is stretched. But the part that goes to the brain, that can be instruction dependent. So I can not respond if I'm supposed to not respond. And I can vigorously respond if I'm supposed to vigorously respond. But that time scale is slower than the spinal. So here's the first response when the muscle is stretched. And then the secondary response. This first response is involuntary. It's coming from my spinal cord. The second response is voluntary. And the way you can tell that is because, look, in this case, when you instruct the person to assist it, they still produce the involuntary response. And the muscle is stretched. Okay. So this information, as the muscle is stretched, goes to the brain. In particular, information comes in from the spinal cord, it gets sent back up to the brain, it goes to the brainstem, then to the thalamus, and then it reaches the somatosensory cortex, and here's the motor cortex. When it reaches the motor cortex, these sending commands bring the information back down, and then you activate the muscle. So this pathway is called the short latency pathway because it goes to the spinal cord. This pathway is called the long latency pathway because it goes to the brain. So the long latency pathway can take as much as 80, 90 milliseconds. The short latency pathway can be as short as 20, even 30 milliseconds. So your fastest response is from the spinal cord. Relatively unprogrammable. Your slowest response is the one that goes to the cortex. Okay. And here's a way to measure some of these responses. So here's an ankle that's being suddenly stretched. So here's the stretch of the ankle down here. Here's the muscle response that's recorded. And let's now look at the time it takes for this information to reach the brain. Up here is electrodes that are placed on the somatosensory cortex. So you see it takes about 50 milliseconds after the stretch starts for the somatosensory cortex to detect the stretch. How long does it take from the motor cortex to get back to the leg? Well, here's it when the stimulation is given to the motor cortex. This is when a pulse is given to the motor cortex, TMS it's called. It takes about 30 milliseconds before there's a response in the muscle. So about 50 milliseconds from the leg to the cortex, about 30 milliseconds from the cortex back to the leg. So about 80 milliseconds for that loop to take place. Any questions? All right, our final slide. So on Wednesday, I described to you the afferent system, and I mentioned to you that, well, you can have a scenario where through what's called large fiber neuropathy, those afferents, muscle spindles, die out. And this is often a problem that starts in distal systems and then it becomes proximal. Also in diabetes, you can have large fiber neuropathy. So here's an example of movements in a healthy individual and a patient that has suffered from this neuropathy. And what I want to show you is that three-phase EMG burst, agonist, antagonist, agonist. It's normal in both individuals, but there's a difference in the afferent itself. So here's a healthy individual. Here's when they make a movement. You see that movement that's taking place. This is the thumb movement, like this. And here's the muscle, in this case a flexor, and the thumb, agonist, antagonist, agonist. And here's a patient without afferents from their thumb. And they can still make that movement. You see it here. But they also generate this EMG that goes So what's the difference? What happens when you lose your affluence? Here's an example of what happens when you lose your affluence. So what you can do is that you can press on something and close your eyes and still keep pressing. Right? So you can generate a force or move to a position and maintain that position without having to look at it. But if you don't have muscle spindles, you can make that movement, but without muscle spindles, your fingers will drift, as you see here. You can't maintain that position without the sensory feedback. Any questions? Have a great weekend. See you Monday.